All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're looking at this truly fascinating historical paradox centered around the Romanov dynasty. We're going to unpack how a staggeringly vast empire, one that actually started out as a deeply traditional, heavily patriarchal society, ended up being shaped, expanded, and completely modernized by some of history's absolute most formidable female rulers. It's this wild story of radical transformation that really kind of flips our whole understanding of power and cultural evolution right on its head.
And, well, that brings us to the core mystery we're looking at today. How on earth did a society that literally hid its women away from the public eye end up producing some of the most powerful empresses the world has ever seen? I mean, it's a massive contradiction, right? We're talking about women going from a state of total, complete isolation to commanding an absolute empire that stretched across the globe. So let's look at how this incredible shift actually kicked off.
Section 1. Breaking social chains, the mandated integration.
So to really grasp this era of empresses, we've got to look at the radical social reforms that set the stage. And the thing is, this wasn't some slow, natural evolution over centuries. No, it was this sudden, mandated integration of women into public life that literally broke the chains of the past. Think about this. Noble women used to be strictly confined to their homes, like completely hidden from the world. They were only allowed to leave to go to church or the royal palace. It was so intense that grooms often weren't even allowed to see their brides before the wedding day. No way, right? But then, contrast that with the liberated status that followed shortly after, where women were suddenly out attending banquets, mixing with men, and just becoming absolute fixtures of the social scene. Now you might be wondering, how did that happen so fast? Well, the rules were essentially rewritten by force. The state literally mandated social integration. They forced the nobles to bring their wives and daughters out to public events, like those famous lavish summer garden parties in St. Petersburg, and those old restrictive clothes and veils, completely banned. It was an intentional, top-down cultural shock to the system. But by forcing women out of isolation and into the social fabric, it totally laid the groundwork for them to eventually take the reins of power. Which brings us to Section 2, the era of Iron Women, a golden age of power. Once those veils were lifted, both literally and figuratively, it paved the way for something just extraordinary. A genuine golden age driven by a sequence of incredibly capable Iron Women. We start with Empress Catherine I, and this is really a cinematic moment in the history we're unpacking. This was the exact moment a woman first stepped into immense, absolute imperial power. She basically pioneered female leadership in a space that had been exclusively a boys' club for centuries, proving absolutely that a woman could hold the highest authority in the land. And building right on that foundation, we get Empress Anna Ivanova. She didn't just passively inherit the throne, she actively commanded the state. She kept pushing the empire's dominance against external threats and firmly locked in this newfound female authority. Basically, her reign proved that Catherine's rule wasn't just some historical glitch, but the start of a really powerful new normal.
Then we arrive at Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. Her reign is often seen as the empire's absolute peak, a true golden age. Under her watch, the empire hit these extraordinary territorial and cultural milestones. She managed to stabilize the whole realm while simultaneously launching it into an era of just unprecedented prosperity and expansion.
Section 3. Empire of a Sixth of Earth. The massive expansion. And speaking of expansion, we really need to take a step back and appreciate the sheer scale of the territory they commanded. 1/6, that is the fraction of the entire Earth's surface this empire eventually covered. Over this 300-year period, the empire grew so massively that it dominated a staggering chunk of the globe. I mean, just wrap your head around that level of territorial dominance for a second. So, where exactly did all that land come from? Well, the empire evolved from this collection of small, disjointed, and honestly constantly threatened villages into a global powerhouse. It stretched all the way from the waters of the Baltic Sea, straight across the brutal expanses of Siberia. It absorbed the amazingly diverse Caucasus region, and even brought parts of Poland and Finland under its flag. This was a massive, massive undertaking, uniting all these incredibly diverse populations, languages, and cultures under one single banner. Moving on to Section 4. Renaissance of Arts and Sciences, the Cultural Awakening. But here's the thing. This era wasn't just about military might or drawing bigger lines on a map. There is an equally impressive intellectual and cultural awakening happening at the exact same time. Before this era, knowledge was strictly, tightly controlled by isolated theological schools. Education was super limited, mostly just restricted to religious texts. But after these reforms kicked in, boom,
We see the sudden establishment of European-style universities. The curriculum completely exploded to include the sciences, mathematics, geography, secular arts, the whole shebang. It was a massive leap from a restrictive, intellectual dark age straight into broad, secular, scientific exploration.
In this educational boom, it ultimately birthed a legendary era of literary giants. We've got Lomonosov, who actually reformed the language itself. And then he's followed by absolute heavyweights like Pushkin, Gogol, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky. These guys brought the empire's arts right onto the global stage. They weren't just writing good stories, they were mastering the profound depiction of the human soul, the agonizing internal conflicts, and the incredibly complex realities of human existence.
What you really should take away from this, though, is the sheer speed of this cultural boom. They managed to catch up to the highly established literary and theatrical traditions of Western Europe in just 60 to 70 years. Decades, that's it. It was this highly accelerated renaissance that suddenly rivaled cultural powers that had been developing for centuries. It is a huge testament to the immense foundational changes those empresses put into place.
Section 5. The last Tsar, an isolated leader. But as we know, history is rarely just a straight line of endless progress. As we contrast this incredibly collaborative, expansive golden age of the empresses with what came next, we kind of have to take a chilling look ahead. That vibrant, transformative era eventually gave way to a future where the entire structure of power shifted back. It narrowed down to a singular, increasingly isolated figure who had to carry the massive weight of all that history, all that expansion, and all those diverse cultures we just talked about.
160 million. That was the population of this completely transformed, wildly expanded empire. And the immense, frankly crushing burden of ruling over those 160 million diverse souls would eventually fall squarely onto the shoulders of just one man, the last Tsar, a leader who was left almost entirely alone to manage the incredible, swirling complexities of this modernized behemoth.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to consider. Could any single ruler, no matter who they were, actually sustain the sheer weight of an empire that was forged, expanded, and culturally awakened by the formidable iron women of the past? It's a staggering question about the nature of isolated power versus the dynamic, mold-breaking leadership we saw earlier. Keep that in mind as you reflect on the incredible historical transformations we've covered today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.